Thank you very much for coming and staying. I'm a theoretical psychoanalyst. I know nothing about biology and microbiology, so my presentation has to do with the macroevolutionary stages, as I think it's self-explanatory. I've been very interested in the connections between body and mind, and I have an interconnected series of presentations prepared in the COVID years that have to do with the evolution from one macro stage to the next. So these are hypotheses, and they're inferential and they're conceptual. So I don't speak very well extemporaneously or at all, so I'm going to read. Can you hear me very well? Okay. Evolutionist William James held that as new forms of being appeared, they could only be the result of a redistribution of original materials, that no new natures or factors not present at the beginning were introduced at later stages. So nowhere is this more relevant than in the study and reconstruction of the natural history of semiosis, which, according to the Barberian principle of code poesis, may well be the engine of evolution itself. In tracing the evolutionary development of semiosis, however, it is important to consider the distinctions between various types of coding systems for different kinds of information and to account for these differences systematically. And since it is no longer possible to separate observer from observed, we are obliged to put ourselves, our senses, perspective, and especially our language in the equation. I begin by going very far back to conceptualize each of the transition phases leading to Barbieri's major macroevolutionary semiotic shifts. And these include transitions from organic codes and biological signals to differentiated feelings in natural emotional expressions, from signified mental representations and sign markings and artifacts, from the emergence of vocal signals to the gradual use of orogestural word signs into fluent symbolic language. Each of these exhibits different forms of transmission to convey ever more distinct kinds of information. My competence is in the neural realm, filtered through the theoretical prism of a revised developmental model of mind based on stages of semiotic development, beginning at birth. In particular, I focus on the dream as bridge between body and mind and portal into earlier modes of thought. I am a Freudian. But here I go to the genesis of mind, when things felt in the body were registered in cortical regions now sufficiently connected to represent the felt experience by the brain. The growth of the cortex produces not only major organizational change, from which sprout growth spurts in limbic, memory, and emotion system circuitry, but these expanding functions impact on an increasingly complex organism with synergistically operating interconnections from brain stem and subcortical regions to the human cortex. This synergy changes everything: motivation, action, interaction, goals, and thought. To organize these ideas, I lean on three of the evolutionary processes and principles that underlie the paradigm that I proposed last year. And these are thresholds likened to windows of time that build up in critical periods wherein exposure to a new function occurs. Phase transition processes that organically, individually, and societally lead to changes in state and level of organization in consciousness, and internalization and externalization, processes that occur and reoccur in recursive loops, accounting for the projection outward of what is internal and the internalization of what is external. We see these developmental processes, oscillations, interpersonally, intrapsychically, and via their manifest products throughout evolutionary history. So now I go into prehistory and posit where, how, and in what way the origins of feelings and emotions became visibly expressed. How these embodied, meaningful, naturally expressive configurations subsequently came to be signified in imagery. Prehistoric hominids, like all animals, were motivated by survival needs and basic drives, prompted to action instinctually and by the body. Yet hominids gradually differentiate from all other species by virtue of certain anatomical and cerebral advantages, elaborated and reinforced over millennia. To understand just how embodied our ancient drives and feelings were at the outset, we speculate from the dawn of habilis how increasing neural feedback loops evolved and grew, reinforcing connections from body to brain and back. Simply stated, there was a point in the evolution of the human nervous system when visceral bodily urges interwove with the brain. Specifically, I'm not going to give it away. I'm going to wait. At this point, feelings beyond instinctual drives started to be felt, and after a certain neural threshold was reached, became externalized in embodied expressions and seen. My hypothesis posits that these cortically dependent emotional and visual stimuli might also have subsequently yielded the advancement from natural signal to sign functions. In other words, that emotional expressions are the wellsprings and the genesis of neural semiosis, building on a unique trait belonging to our species, the assignment, recognition, and creation of meaning. It seems to me that the first meanings were feelings, and feelings are felt in the body. How then did they get to the brain? In drawing a parallel between how proteins are formed when amino acids bond in a specific sequence, Barbieri writes, quotes, "Feelings come into being when events that occur separately in the body and the brain are somehow brought together into a single experience." Close quotes. It is that somehow brought together that I address here. The enteric nervous system. Antonio Damasio has been writing about feelings since the 90s, but only very recently, 2018, does he draw attention to the neglected role of the gut. Some of the neurological data that follows is taken from his account. However, despite their rigorous research, neuroscientists are loath to venture into inferential analysis regarding what their data might mean in the bigger picture. For this, one must be willing to go to a bigger picture, risking a leap in conceptual synthesis, something that Suzanne Langer extolled for the conceptual benefits that systematic pursuit of generalizing abstractions can yield. My question is, how did feelings become visually expressed? And my hypothesis begins with an assumption that communication within small groups would have been of supreme survival value for early hominids, so that the gradual externalization of inner feeling and intent, accompanied by expressive sounds, would have been foremost in early communication. Inasmuch as many of our primate cousins and other animal species communicate state and intentions via visually and audibly physical signals, we may confidently assert that our given repertoire of basic emotional expressions are innate and among the firmest, phylogenetically secured of universal human characteristics. Elsewhere, I have suggested referring to the basic repertoire of universal affect expressions as natural affects, while restricting the term emotions to the more subtle, differentiated states acquired during development and learned within specific cultures. This distinction helps differentiate the primal, unregulated cries of raw, untutored affects from more complex, elaborate emotions. That said, the question remains, how did they first appear expressively? A quick overview of the human nervous system in toto is in order, I think, from my account to be complete. So the human nervous system has central and peripheral components. Its main organ, the cerebrum brain, contains two hemispheres connected by a corpus callosum, enveloped by the cerebral cortex divided into lobes. The cortex also includes a region visible only in the internal mesial surface called the cingulate cortex. Two non-visible regions deep under the frontal parietal lobe and the insular cortex and hippocampus, all important for memory, hidden in the temporal lobe. The central nervous system, by the way, when I speak about evolution and the brain, I'm always implying the central nervous system because it's all connected. I don't make a separation between the brain and the body. In psychoanalysis, we avoid that separation. The central nervous system connects all parts of the body to the brain in feedback loops through bundles of axons that aggregate, which constitute the peripheral nervous system. But not all are purely neural. In particular, the peripheral conveyances related to emotional feelings are also humoral, involving chemical signals traveling in blood capillaries that penetrate areas of the nervous system devoid of the blood-brain barrier at the brainstem, higher telencephalon and dorsal root ganglia. These are primitive areas that receive these chemical signals directly. The dorsal root ganglia, in fact, gather together cell bodies of neurons whose axons distribute widely in viscera, sending body signals to the central nervous system. Loopholes are areas without the blood-brain barrier where the body's influence is direct via chemical molecules, exerting their impact through the brainstem to the cortices. Sensory channels and feeling channels are quite different in kind, then. One of the oldest parts, mostly outside volitional control and crucial for its role in life regulation, is the autonomous nervous system. This consists of the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric nervous systems, the last of paramount importance here for its critical role in feelings and emotions. However, far from peripheral, the enteric nervous system may well be central, second only to the brain in structural and functional importance. Believed to antedate the central nervous system, the enormous enteric system contains an estimated 100 to 600 million intrinsic neurons that connect to higher brain centers through the vagus nerve, and is now thought to be instrumental in affecting mood and state. Its enormous number of neurons, equaling or more than the spinal cord, and its autonomous functioning make it a sort of second gut brain, which may well be at the top of the feeling chain of command, going to, not from the brain. The brain can, however, modulate its functioning. Fibers of the vagus nerve, our main conduit of neural signals from thorax and abdomen to the brain, are mostly unmyelated, meaning that their impulses can be conveyed laterally, providing opportunistic shortcuts in the creation of feelings, suggesting that they originate from earlier times. Given all of this, and if the earliest organisms were simple tubes for ingesting nutrients and excreting waste, it is not far-fetched to speculate that the ancient enteric nervous system may indeed have been the first brain. Moreover, at the experiential level, all early life and care is closely associated with ingestion and excretion. When we feel emotions like grief, fear, anger, elation, we feel them in the gut, disrupting appetite and digestion, making their registration and regulation critical for the homeostatic role they play throughout life, especially during development. More so in ancient humans, as they were probably less modulated, still closely tied to instinctual drives, very strong affects, and vital needs. Here, the key role of memory and imitative learning play an influential role. So from vague stirrings of proprioception would have grown of necessity the coevolution of exteroceptive, interoceptive senses, along with intensely felt feelings, reinforcing attention and memory and impacting dramatically on mental imaging, while helping to expand the all-important human cortex. Upright posture and increasing bipedal mobility in habilis would have required memorizing route, place, person, and process, reinforcing what starts immediately in facial recognition. And from the cortex begins new learning. This would have engaged small children early on in imitative learning, facial and gestural mimicry at first, growing into learning proper in conduct and necessary skills in group collaboration. This puts imitative learning at the forefront of early human development. Along with kinetic imitation, mental imaging, the mind's eye, would have further enhanced visual recall of experiences, forming dynamic schemas internally of all kinds. As with most in the animal kingdom, the roles of imitative learning and play dominate early childhood, but in humans, there are added dimensions. The famous peekaboo game, initially a test of a toddler's object constancy and imagination, introducing the pretend or as if dimension to play, games, and storying narratives. The ability to retain an object in the mind's eye, to discern between real and pretend, and to anticipate, all build on cortical functions. Along with the growth of short and long-term memory, the accretion of inner picturing underscores how imaging processes learned by imitation now layer over primitive affect schemas, with ever more articulate learned gestural linguistic signifiers adding to the mix. Importantly, distinctions need to be made in gradations from earlier to later forms of imaging function, since the origin and slow development of this capacity is functionally dependent on the cortex, a surface area that evolved very slowly. Initially, experience would have been highly subjective, as it is at the start of life, limited to primary needs, the goals of primitive life governed by survival, food, shelter, water, procreation, proximity. Once registry and expression of feelings began to have more meaning, communication and collaboration in extended group relations would have become prominent and more complex, adding to the stimulus load. Now, the dynamics of context become all important because this daily inpouring of impressions may in part be filtered in habitual situations where norms and expectations are familiar, but not all can. Daily frustrations, dilemmas, constraints, new impressions, or events require further processing and adjustments as life becomes more complex. So, we continue our processing work in deep sleep, where an unconscious, purely subjectivity called primary process runs free. The condensation of experiences in imagery layered by memory systems emerges quite observably in dreams, where current impressions conflate with the past, emotions couple with perceptions, conjuring composite pictographs, and desire is given visible form. Dreams are a unique instrument through which to see how signification takes place. Our most fascinating natural mental product. They shift effortlessly on the cusp between feeling, remembering, experiencing, and depicting in a deeply unconscious state, displaying a vocabulary spun out of subjective experience. Both portal into and bridge from body to mind, dreams exhibit in statu nascendi how felt ideas coagulate into condensed images in timeless personal dreamscapes. A neural passageway like a process plant, dreams are creative patchworks constructed out of fleeting impressions distant memories and current feelings, revealing how meanings form according to a hierarchy of emotional and regulatory strategies nurtured by cognition and imagination. They garner their immense power by encapsulating idea, feeling, and meaning instantaneously in an imagery expressing embodied cognition, the form of a felt idea bursting directly from gut intelligence. So this is Freudian now. The Freudian theory of dreams has a latent and a manifest content. The latent is the ideas, the manifest is what we see in the imagery. The dream's manifest latent two-tiered semiotic structure, based on metaphorical and metonymic processes, is central in all human cognition and continues issuing from a sensory motor matrix throughout life. At the, quotes, umbilicus, Freud called it, of every dream are its latent ideas. And it is these that are expressed through the manifest content imagery, narratorized by a way of secondary revision that organizes a storyline through syllabical verbal recounting. Via the dreamer's fragmentary comments and associations, we unpack the sources and multiple meanings that are condensed in each element. And by transcribing them into language, we move from unconscious through preconscious to conscious awareness, obviously in an interpretation. From neural transmission to felt icon to denotive referencing, uncovering the semiotic steps in the laws of meaning. Renowned for his studies of forebrain functioning during dreaming, the neurology of dream sleep, laid out by Michael Soames, confirms many of Freud's insights. I am incredibly indebted to Michael Soames. Throughout the COVID period, we corresponded in emails. He answered all of my questions promptly. I'm really very indebted to him. So the dream process is driven by subcortical, mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine circuitry in particular. Its motivating spark, the wish, issues from an upsurge of limbic and basal ganglionic activity, structures responsible for drives, affects, and autobiographical memory, and where the prefrontal lobes are partly deactivated during sleep, the posterior cortex remain active in dreamings. So Soames views this as the physiological correlate of a topographical regression, since what is older in time is more primitive in form. Freud called this unconscious mode of thought the primary process. And the complicated process by which the dream's core thoughts are portrayed in imagery, he called the dream or the mind's work. During the dream's formal regression, the earlier form is revived, quotes, the fabric of the dream thoughts is resolved into its raw material. That's Freud. When interpreting dreams through the linguistic secondary process, we trace and unpack this raw material in meanings that are condensed into its image elements. This uncovers a semiotic sequence that recapitulates the semiotic course towards conscious awareness. So the importance of the Freudian theory of dream interpretation is this. It presents a microcosm of two transitions. The first, when sensory emotive input and impulses merge with mnemonic processes generating signified pictographs in figurative or iconic form, and the second, when these image elements are unpacked via associations and translated interpretively through the cultural medium of language and verbal form. These two transformations, the first, a transfiguration from senses and emotions into image, the second, a transposition in sign form from image to language, icon to verbal sign, illustrate a semiotic sequence that recapitulates the gradual accretion of conscious awareness through the use of signs and symbol systems. Cognition began in imaging at a phase in memory development when raw affects and basic needs predominate, generating composite imagery of what was felt with what was seen in dynamic schemas. This differs from later, more complex sign representations, conveying meanings that have been filtered through semiotic instruments, like learned signals, signs, and symbolic perceptual elements expressing subjectivity, but while including and integrating greater aspects of culturally acquired signs and learned behaviors. We would be at a loss to even begin interpreting, let alone understanding the multiple meanings encased in dreams without Freud's basic dictionary for their composite meaning forms. And we would be unable to articulate or communicate our interpretations of their meanings without an efficient common language. The linguistic code, our primary universal cultural tool, communicative medium, instrument of reason, reflection, and thought, our inner companion and internal guide. Language not only enables us to express our thoughts and ideas, but creates the verbal glue that binds and bonds us to our group and society. More even than home or land, our mother tongue forms the deepest part of our identity. Early on, stringing together a core biographical memory rooted in our origins. It is hard not to conceive of a slow developmental progression from early hominid embodied communication in primitive expressive signal calls to more discrete single-word signs encompassing personal names, objects, and processes, to a gradual stringing together of more and more word labels into syntactical change. The propulsion of recounting and storytelling invites phrases to add adjectival embellishments in a concatenation of and then, and even the basic sentence promotes a declaration of desire or intent in the formulation of a thought. And so this phase transition from the advent of neural codes to the establishment of cultural codes would have been spurred by collective interactions, realized and uttered in small hominid groups in pursuing a primary need to devise the most efficient, expedient, and parsimonious mode for communicating a common language. In sum, by asking what came before and hypothesizing the in-betweens, I have laid out possible microevolutionary stages leading up to each of the three major Barberian macroevolutionary shifts, positing one, that innate emotional expressions, affect feelings emerged from the transmission of feelings originating in the primal enteric nervous system. Two, that affect expressions would have gradually differentiated, becoming labeled by vocal signs via embodied orogestural forms of communication. And three, that from persistent use of signs in different media would have evolved a syntactically structured, cultural-specific form of communication. This evolutionary progression from organic to felt affect signals, to the use of embodied signs, to cultural symbol systems, mirrors the stratified development of the human brain, each phase prompted by the developed employment of a new form of coding device. Thank you.
So now we have for one or two questions for Dr. Anna.
You talked about coding thresholds or code thresholds. Can you reflect on this empirically?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
You mentioned code thresholds.
I mentioned what?
Code thresholds.
Thresholds.
I didn't understand.
Threshold.
Threshold.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes,
Yeah,
threshold.
you mentioned them. Can you, what do
I
you mean?
mentioned conceptually, yeah.
Is it any empirical concept?
Well, you formulate the empirical. It's a conceptual organizing principle for how something changed form.
Yeah, because I published recently this also that there are thresholds, but this is a theory now. Yeah, I cannot
It's a
say there are so
hypothesis.
or so many codes, and then you have a switch to a new species or to whatever. So what happens at the threshold, in your perspective?
So what happened was from the body through the vagus nerve, signals went to the brain and it began to be represented. Feelings began to be represented. Then the memory systems began to include memory, creating images. So the representation is the beginning of human cognition. Yeah? Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
So may I continue from this point? Then maybe what you are implying is that the first code is the emotions felt at the gut that then are adapted and perceived through the memory and translated into another thing.
Well, actually, the step that I was addressing, the specific step, was how did gut feelings, how did the feelings that originated in the gut reach the brain to be represented and so felt, because you don't feel them until they're actually in the brain, right? So evolutionarily there had to be some process. It's a hypothesis that the enteric nervous system, which is the oldest part, and the evidence is it has so many neurons and that we feel in the gut, it's a hypothesis, that's all.
But
It's a viable hypothesis.
society really deals with those problems with hormones, with interaction of nervous system and brain. So there are a lot of people working on those problems. So right. Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you very much. Thank you.